We just heard a panel talk about books being banned and being basically disinvited to events because the book was controversial. One of the things we want to have a conversation on is what is happening in our country with respect to First Amendment rights. And like I said, we have Jay here. She's going to give a talk, and but she's going to lead a conversation, or I might join her to lead a conversation on this, because we would like to know what you are experiencing, what you are witnessing, what you have heard first or second hand in terms of this kind of issue. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jay Newton-Small. She is the executive editor and vice president of Albuquerque Journal. Her journalistic career includes Bloomberg News and Time magazine. Her best-selling book, Broad Influence, discusses how life is changing as women approach the tipping point. I hope that is true in this day and age, I don't know. She founded Memory Wall, an organization dedicated to creating better health outcomes by employing journalists to write the life stories of memory care patients. And she's got a profound, diverse history all by herself. She's been to so many countries and understands the need for diversity and plurality of voices. And so I'm so glad that you're our Albuquerque Journal executive editor now, because we need that at the Journal. So I'm going to leave it to you. You can stand at the podium, you can have a seat and have your conversation with the people here. That mic, and then this mic is also available.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I thought I would just give a little bit of a talk about, I think, where I see things standing in journalism and in the country at large, just in very broad terms, and then I'm going to probably move pretty quickly to take questions. But there's an ancient Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. And I think we are living very much the fruits of that curse right now. I think of what's happening right now as a once in every 500-year leap forward in technology. So you had like the Renaissance, the Gutenberg press, and now you're seeing sort of the internet/AI technology, and we're about 30 years into this leap forward that we're seeing, and it's having profound impacts both on journalism and on politics. I'm going to focus mostly on journalism and politics because that's where the bulk of my career has been. I spent most of my career in Washington, D.C. covering the White House and politics for both Bloomberg and Time. And so I'm going to take the journalism side first. In journalism, people forget that in 1929, Black Friday was actually caused by fake news. That the collapse of the market was driven by a run on the banks that was actually not founded on anything but rumors. And in 1934, when FDR took office, one of the first things he did was create something called the Public Trust in News. And that basically mandated that everything to the knowledge of the publisher at the time, everything that they printed had to be true. That it had to be balanced. If you quoted a Republican, you had to quote a Democrat, and it had to be equal parts local, national, and international. So you might remember back in the day when they had those news breaks every hour on channel, the sort of ABC, NBC, CBS, those news breaks were always equally balanced with local, national, international news. Now, that kind of journalism, it's what Jay Rosen, who's a sort of historian of journalism at NYU, calls the New Testament journalism, the Old Testament being the sort of journalism where it's not necessarily rooted in truth, it's all rumor and innuendo. The Old Testament journalism really ruled until this time that New Testament journalism arrived, and that New Testament journalism was much more rooted in truth, and that lasted from about 1934 to 1987. And then in 1986, all three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, were bought by corporate interests. And those corporate interests wanted to increase their profits. They saw radio shows like Rush Limbaugh and the advent of CNN as a threat to their profits. And they basically argued that they didn't have to follow the same public trust in news that these networks had to follow and that the newspapers had to follow. And so therefore, it was an unfair corporate advantage. And they lobbied the FCC to dismantle the public trust in news. And that led to the FCC, and I will say in the statement they said, and this is where Fox News' logo comes from, that news is quote unquote fair and balanced and no longer needs to be regulated. And so, therefore, there's so much breaking news out of Las Cruces this morning. I've been that's why I was a little late. If you didn't see, there was a mass shooting, unfortunately, overnight with 3 dead and 16 injured. It's been a little bit of a crazy morning and I keep getting calls on it. So getting back to the idea of New Testament news, that was sort of, again, dismantled in 1987, and we have now the news that we have today. There's a great book by Ken Aletta called 3 by Mice, who's an incredible New Yorker author that sort of really tracks the dismantlement of the public trust in news. And at the end of it, he basically predicts that we will soon have a reality TV president, because that's the way in which we were going towards. It was this combination of ratings and fake news and orchestrated news, and that's really where news was going. And so fast forward, obviously, to today, and we have this kind of reality TV president, and we have a sense of news that is incredibly fractured. We no longer have a shared sense of truth. Even in our paper, whenever we publish the AP, we get tons of complaints that the AP is biased, the AP is anti-Trump, the AP is no longer the sort of impartial news gathering organization that it once was. And so it's really difficult these days to navigate news, I think, because there is no sense of shared truth. Everything is so fractured, and people self-select into these silos of news that is delivered to you by algorithms on Facebook that reinforce your sort of beliefs in whatever it is. And it's very rare to see people challenge those beliefs, to look at other sides, to look at, if you watch MSNBC, go watch Fox News for a while. If you watch Fox News, go watch MSNBC. It's very rare for people to really kind of look beyond whatever their beliefs are that are being self-reinforced. And navigating that as a local paper is actually really challenging. That's an issue I'm going to come back to. I'm going to first now I'm going to talk instead a little bit about how this disruption, this once in a 500-year disruption, is affecting politics. And the two will come together. So in politics, you see, I think we've had 20 years now of wave elections. Every single election is this reaction to the previous election, and every single time it's this, whatever knee-jerk it is, whatever it's just against whatever is the current status quo. And that is incredibly damaging, but people are hungering for instant gratification. These phones have given us a sense that, if you want your food delivered by Grubhub, or by, if you want your hotels booked or your car to come pick you up with Uber, it's all instantaneous and it just comes right away. And that expectation is now being applied to politics and the federal government. Now, the federal government was built by our founding fathers to be incredibly slow and deliberative. The sort of balance of power by all three branches of the government viewed rapid change as akin to tyranny. And so the idea that you could move the government rapidly has always been a huge challenge. Every single president for the last, in the modern era, has tried to change the footprint of government. The only person who actually succeeded, one second, I just have to tell someone to that I cannot talk to them right now. Hold on a second. Government is expected to deliver this rapid change. Now, obviously, the government can't deliver this rapid change. The Social Security Administration isn't going to suddenly turn on a dime and start producing digital checks, which it took them, honestly, 15 years to do that when digital checks first came out. It's a very slow-moving, very cumbersome force, and that bureaucracy, that sort of fight between technology and bureaucracy, I think is one of the most fascinating fights of our time. It is essentially the one that is going to determine our future, and one that we're just at the beginning of. I don't think we've actually seen a huge amount of this fight. I think we're just beginning to understand the repercussions that technology is going to have on our federal government as we move forward. And you're seeing that with Elon Musk and with Doge and with all the changes that Donald Trump is trying to rock. Remember, now, the only person who actually did change the footprint of government up until this point was Bill Clinton. In the 8 years that he was president, he actually ended up reducing the size of government by 414,000 people through a series of targeted buyouts. And that was done in collaboration with the unions, and it was done through a lot of attrition. And so obviously this kind of rapid change that you're seeing right now that's really affecting our state and people frankly all over the country is much more about technology. It's about, as Mark Zuckerberg said when he founded Facebook, moving fast and breaking things. It's the idea of getting ahead of regulation and sort of moving quickly and apologizing later. And obviously you're seeing that play out now in courts where they've moved very quickly and the courts now are catching up to them saying, no, you can't do this. And that is, again, part of bureaucracy. It's part of the three branches of government and the balance of government where you're going to have to get all three branches to agree to do something in order for it to actually be enacted. And that is super, super difficult. So I think it's super fascinating seeing these forces play out during our lifetime. And at the same time, you see a weakening of journalism. So getting back to journalism, this weakening of the sort of, fourth estate, the estate that's supposed to really keep and check the government, keep and make them answer to the rest of the people, hold them accountable. That fourth estate is again breaking. And so we're left with this place where there's a lot less investigative reporters than there ever have been. There's a lot less newsroom people than there have been. We've seen a decimation of newsrooms. During COVID alone, we saw 30,000 newsroom layoffs. Before that, in the decades and before that, you've seen over 100,000 newsroom layoffs since the advent of the internet. You've seen a lot of papers fold. There's news deserts now, which encompass enormous parts of not just America, but New Mexico. And so in these troubling times, news is weakest, and we don't have the same place, the same ability to do the function for which we were built. And as the Washington Post sort of motto says, democracy dies in darkness. And so if we don't have that function, how do we then hold accountable and really document the changes that we're seeing both in politics and in our own newsrooms? And so to me, when I first joined the Albuquerque Journal, to get a little bit more about my background, I was at Bloomberg News and then Time Magazine, but then I left in 2017 to start a company that was a venture-backed company, and it was very much at the intersection of healthcare and journalism and AI. It's been really fascinating to sort of work on the other side of things for journalism, the technology side of things, where the whole sort of premise is to move fast and break things. And then to come back into journalism again and I'm taking a lot of those principles that I learned in startup world and applying them to the journal in a lot of ways, hopefully for the forces of good. And a lot of these are sort of double-edged swords that can be used for both good and bad. And so you have to be really careful with how you apply things like AI, things like algorithms, things like technology. I looked around at the news landscape after I sold my companies last year and was sort of thinking, like, how would I want to get involved back into this beautiful state that I moved to 4 years ago. I'd been working remotely the entire time and wanted to get much more involved in the community and help people here. And how could I help journalism as a whole? And coming from Time Magazine, I love Time dearly. It remains near and dear to my heart. I remain a contributor there, but I really do believe that national news to some degree is dying because we no longer have that shared sense of truth. We no longer have a market where people want to read a general set of news. And so people are self-selecting into those slices and dices, those little tiny slivers of news, and preferring those slivers of news to get their news, those news outlets to get their news rather than a generalist outlet like Time Magazine. But I do think that the future of news is very much in local news, and that's why I chose to come to the Albuquerque Journal. You have inherent into the model of the Albuquerque Journal local buy-in, a community that is very interested in what's happening in itself, like what's happening here, what's going on. You have a hunger for local news that doesn't exist on the national level, that isn't necessarily sliceable or diceable. It's just the basic, like what happened with like my son's varsity El Dorado soccer game, what happened with like last night, the Lobos winning, yay, against Marquette. You have a group of people who are super invested into understanding everything from sports to weather to what's happening in the state legislature and the Roundhouse to what's happening in Las Cruces and this terrible shooting that's happening today. And so what we're trying to build, and I'm working with the Langs here who are the owners of the paper, I originally actually tried to buy the paper from them. They did not want to sell it. I think working with the Langs to be able to create a 5-year plan where we can create a model for local news that is sustainable, that is something that we can move forward into the next generation. They've now owned the paper for 100 years as of next year, and move forward to the next 100 years of being able to provide that service and that important fourth estate to the people of New Mexico. Pretty far away from it right now. We're not anywhere near sustainability, but we're looking at all different models, and this is something where we're really treating it almost like a startup, which I've really enjoyed. Being able to look at hybrid nonprofit for-profit models, being able to look at different kinds of grants versus for-profit models. We're doing an incubator program now in the next year with Google, so that we're going to understand like the different kinds of journalistic models that exist. And we're hopeful that we can find the right model that not only works for us, but might be replicable across the country for other local newspapers that are struggling to survive. So, what does this all mean? I guess I would say, on a national level, I'm really glad not to be in Washington, D.C. anymore covering the national news. I covered the White House and sat on the White House Correspondents Association board for many years, and watching the dismantlement of the White House Correspondents Association, how they no longer can determine who has access to pools, who has access to the briefing room, I think is just a real travesty in how journalism is treated and how journalists are treated in Washington, D.C. Most of my friends, when I left journalism to do my startup company, were like, "You're crazy, you're like leaving the best job in journalism, you can do anything you want for Time magazine." I was covering stories all over the world in 5 continents. And now they see me and they're like, "Oh man, I totally get where you were." Like, I want to leave too, it sucks here. I think there's a huge sense of exhaustion amongst the White House press corps and amongst the Washington press corps. There's a huge sense of dispiritment, that nothing that they do or say is really treated with a sense of credulity by large portions of America, where the sense of truth, again, is not shared by everybody. And whatever they do, whatever they write, there's questions about, well, what is the actual truth? Is this true? Did January 6th actually happen? Was it a revolution or not? These are all questions that remain in limbo for a lot of people in Washington and across the country. And it is that sense of shared truth that I think is very much a contributor to the downfall of news, and something that we are very much hoping to fix in at least Albuquerque on a local level, where we all live here together, we can all see what's happening, and we can all hopefully agree on a shared sense of truth with whatever is going on in our own community. So that's what really does give me hope in this, is not so much what's happening in Washington or what's happening nationally, but the idea that this place, this local news, that this state has a chance now, I think, to really change the way news is done, to hopefully re-engage the community. To that end, I'm making a lot of changes to the journal. And this is the last section of the talk I'm going to give, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. You might have noticed that the opinion section is very different. We have created a color-coded section to help people understand, who is a local columnist, who is a syndicated columnist, who is like an editorial. Mostly because we received so many complaints and people were just very confused by a lot of the copy that we were creating, and they were blaming us for syndication, and they were blaming us for things that we didn't write, we didn't author, and we would be like, hey, this isn't, yes, we chose to run it, but you can't actually say that this is the stance of the journal. We're trying to give you a bunch of different stances so that you have a lot of different options to look at. We've tried to balance out the pages and reform an editorial board that is balanced on Republican and Democratic sides, so that everything that we print is very balanced, and we try to show, point counterpoint has been a big priority of ours, to show if we publish one side, we're going to publish the other side, so you can see both sides of an issue. We've pretty much stopped and suspended all endorsements. We won't be endorsing really on almost any level anymore. We're just going to be presenting facts about each of the candidates to just sort of say to people, here's what we see as strengths and weaknesses of these candidates, and you guys have to make up your own minds. And we also have changed the business section from a once a week section on Mondays to a daily section that's part of the newspaper. We'll probably be doing something similar with Venue, which is our arts section, which prints on Fridays. we'll still have a venue because people still love those TV guides, but like we're gonna try and disperse the art section more into everyday papers so that you get more of a daily sense of art rather than having it all come on Friday. We're really trying to beef up our Sunday edition, so we now have an expanded business section on Sundays, an expanded outside section on Sundays that's really focusing on the incredible natural resources of this state and the tourism prospects for the state, and that's going to be a big focus of ours moving forward. We're starting a podcast to that end. And I will say digital is a huge priority for us. We've got a network of podcasts now, about 10 of them. We're going to aim to double those podcasts in the next year. Like I said, we're starting an outdoors podcast. We already have the Leading News podcast, which we started in January, which if you haven't heard it, I encourage you to listen to it. It's just a daily 8-minute segment of what's happening every day in Albuquerque and across the state of Mexico. You can listen to it on your morning commute. It's super brief, gives you everything from the weather to sports to what's going on in the state legislature and what's happening nationally in a really compact, easy to digest section. And that's gone super viral. We have had over 100,000 YouTube hits on it. We've had, I think, almost 10,000 downloads now, and that's just started 2 months ago in January. So we're super excited about the potential of our digital assets. And we are growing our newsletters. We have a bunch of native newsletters, I think almost 10 of them now as well. We'll be growing our native newsletter assets. We're going to be much more forward on events. So one of the things that I think I really want to try and change, and it won't be suitable for every single editorial board, but certainly for most of them, is that I want to open them up to the community. I find editorial boards are weirdly closed, and they're these secretive things, and it's one of the reasons why people don't trust journalists is they view this sort of very closed process and they don't understand how it's done. I really want to open up most of our editorial boards with, when we have the governor come in or the mayor and make them more town halls. Like anyone from the public can attend. We'll obviously make it ticketed if there's like a gazillion people who show up. But we'll also stream them live to YouTube, live to Facebook, and let people ask questions on those platforms so that we can engage with our audiences as much as possible. I want to try and demystify the process of journalism as much as possible and bring the community into that process so that everybody in Albuquerque and across the state of New Mexico feels like they're a part of that. Finally, one last thing and a big initiative that we're doing is to partner with other papers across the state. There are tons of little papers across, the Cuesta News, the Los Alamos News, papers in Las Cruces, papers in Alamogordo, and they're very interested in running our copy, and we want to be able to use their copy as well. So we're forming a local news kind of consortium, kind of a cooperative that will trade up to a certain amount of articles per month with all of these local papers who join the consortium. Part of that will be working with, for example, Searchlight New Mexico. We ran one of their pieces recently as a first test on the Archdiocese in Santa Fe. I think it went really well, so we're going to be increasing that partnership, and we're going to be hopefully increasing our support of folks like Searchlight and investigative journalists across the state, as well as our own staff in investigative news as we move forward. So that's kind of my overarching wrap of national and local and where I see the paper going, but I welcome all of your questions.
Wow, that was an amazing a lot of material in a short period of time. Thank you very, very much. That was amazing. Okay, let's open it up for questions, and I'll go and hand you the mic so you can ask the question and have the conversation with Jay in that moment.
Good morning. I'm Sherry Burr. I'm an immediate past president of New Mexico Presswomen, and I want to compliment you on the amazing job you're doing at the Journal. It was night and day between your predecessor leaving and your taking over. It was just so wonderful to go away from having all these conservative columnists from the Washington Post on the editorial page daily with no counterbalance as there had been before. You brought more local news, as you've said, and it's really wonderful to see the different stories that you've covered. I can't say enough what an excellent, amazing job you've been doing as the editor of the Journal, so thank you.
Thank you so much, I appreciate that. And I encourage feedback, so all of you in this room, my email's on the website, it's really easy to find. I have a thick skin like a rhino, having covered national politics for 17 years, and I've lived on Twitter for that time, so don't feel like you can ever insult me. If you ever have any feedback, I take feedback really well.
So my question has to do with AI. And do you feel like there's a challenge in terms of sources when you're a journalist or going out? One of the nice things about being in New Mexico is it's easy, as many of us have done in this room, to interview people. But do you have a sense of there's any challenge of sorting out like deep fakes that are out there on the internet or anything like that?
Yeah, it is a huge challenge, and that's a great question. So after I sold my company, one of the things we created was this generative AI model that analyzed a lot of the recordings of senior stories that we did. And I spent about 6 months consulting for OpenAI, building something for them called Project Elephant, where I recruited about 20 journalists to help them build out a search platform for journalism. It actually has been, I think, a total failure in that, they're customizing their search platforms to each industry that they're working with, and this is in competition with Google. So if you're searching for health, or you're a doctor and you're looking for specific research, or you're a lawyer and you're looking for specific court cases, those searches are really easily trainable on an algorithm. For journalism, it's different because we really boil the universe. There's art journalists and police journalists, and there's political journalists and war journalists, and every single issue can be a journalism issue. And so there's not a very easy way for the algorithm to learn, understand what journalists are looking for, because we're looking for everything. And so, what I'm sort of trying to get at is AI, particularly OpenAI, but I think AI in general, is really hard. It's hard for it to get its arms around journalism. And I think of OpenAI as, or really generative AI in general, as a very lazy intern. So you can tell the intern, go look for these articles, and the intern is going to come back to you, and half those articles may be total BS. They'll just make up headlines, make up writers, make up sources, and if you don't check every single one, you're going to get into a lot of trouble because it's totally fake, right? And so that's a big problem with it. AI, so one of the bigger problems with AI is that it's super skewed. There's actually, I would say, 3 big problems with AI. So one is that it is skewed towards a lot of fake news that is hard to root out of the AI systems because they've been built in from basically training it on the internet, and the internet is full of fake stuff. Secondly, I'd say a big problem is bias in the model. So the model is trained towards, away from, I would say, minority perspectives, away from perspectives of, say, women versus men, of minorities versus white people. It is provably very problematic in that it will almost always give you very biased information. I love the story of IBM Watson in 2016. They put Watson onto Twitter for basically 24 hours, and they wanted to see how Watson would react, and Watson rapidly degraded into a racist, sexist, horrible, thing, and then they pulled him off, and they were like, okay, that was bad. And so it is problematic because it's been trained essentially on what is the worst of society, right? The internet is kind of the dregs in a lot of ways of society. It's trained in a lot of that bias. So a lot of bias, a lot of untruths. And then I would say the third problem with AI is it loves to hallucinate. So for Memory Well, when we were doing life stories of seniors, we actually tried using AI to help write these stories. And we had, and so we put in, this was an example, we put in, it has a temperature setting, I don't know if you know this, but at 0, it just takes whatever you've given it and just regurgitates something out of it, but it's totally just based off of the limited data set that you've given it. At 5, which is its maximum setting, it will take everything from the internet, it will take all kinds of liberties. And so we were dealing with people's actual life stories. And so we put in a test model, and this was a woman who'd had multiple sclerosis and complications of that, and Lou Gehrig's disease. She was fairly young. She was, end stage. She was in hospice. She'd had 3 children. She'd been a dental assistant for most of her life. And she lived in North Shore, Chicago, and one of the most proudest moments of her life was that she'd worked for then Senator Obama's campaign and then helped get him elected president. And so the very boring version was like this kind of, timeline of this woman's life, and it was just like, Jane Smith did this and then that and X, Y, and Z. And then we jacked it up to 5, and the 5 was like, Jane Smith, in a feat of dental hygienics, saved the life of Barack Obama on board of Air Force One while fleeing Russia under bombs. Like, it was like this insane story, which was totally entertaining, but absolutely not true and not worth anything we could ever work with, right? Because we deal with the truth. And I think the same would go for journalism, right? Like, we already use AI in our newsroom in that we have Otter that transcribes everything for us. We will have Otter listen to, like, community meetings, school board meetings, and then like try to tell us what's the most important things. Now, obviously, we still have a human there who will know what is the most important thing coming out of the meeting, so we have a backup to make sure that Otter is correct. But like, it's really good at summarizing those kinds of things. If you have like a 6-hour school board meeting, Otter is great at like sort of taking it all down and being like, and here's what was important out of this. But again, you have to double check. You can't just leave it to do it on its own devices. I think that there's no question there's important uses for AI in newsrooms. We're actually starting to train on Gemini. I love the Gemini model, which is Google's AI, because it's trained on YouTube. So it's actually trained on video and imagery as well as words, whereas OpenAI is just trained on text. And so for stuff like graphics, it's amazing. You can sort of say to it, we just did it this week, we've got a graphic coming out in next week's paper where we're like, tell us all of Donald Trump's executive decisions and where they've been stopped by like different courts and what's the next steps for those courts. And it built us this incredible graphic that kind of had squiggly lines going all over the place, and all we had to do was double check it. So stuff like that, I think it's really valuable, and it's an incredible tool that saves us tons of times for our graphic designers, saves us tons of time for like having to transcribe very long, boring meetings. Would I let it write anything and then publish it? No. I think we're really far away from that. But the potential is incredible down the road. And so I think it's something that we want to make sure that we stay at the forefront of, that we harness, that we use. But it is a double-edged sword, like all technology.
I agree with that. Double-edged sword technology. I'm an engineer, so I know what that means. Any other questions? Conversations we want to start? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jennifer Paul. I'm a narrative nonfiction author. Can you hear me? Stand up. Okay. Speak a little louder. A little loud. Okay. I'm thrilled by what you're saying about the expansion of the outside for Albuquerque Journal, especially in light of what's been happening with Outside Magazine in Santa Fe. You spoke to newspapers, but how do you see the future of magazines like Outside in New Mexico that have been real resources for writers, real think tanks for writers, real, John Krakauer wrote into thin air through Outside Magazine, Hampton Sides, who was with us last year. These authors are getting so frustrated with what's becoming basically a clickbait magazine to sell gear. And I'm thrilled by the podcast. I'm just, as a narrative nonfiction writer myself, and my first book was about a mountain guide in Taos who has summited Everest 15 times. What do you see as the opportunities and the challenges available in New Mexico for the Outside Magazine industry?
Wow, I think so. There's tons of opportunity, I believe. Just even why I came here. I road tripped with a couple of girlfriends in 2020 from DC. DC was in misery in 2020. I lived like 6 blocks from Black Lives Matter Plaza. I got tear gas walking my dog. There was helicopters overhead 24/7 and National Guard on every corner, and I was like, I don't want to live through this. So we road tripped and ended up in Santa Fe. Really loved Santa Fe. I love to ski. I love to hike. I love love to kayak, and so this place was like a paradise. And I was like, wow, and there's like nobody here, right? Like it's not like hiking in Aspen where it's, every 5 feet you're coming across somebody on the trail. Somebody described New Mexico to me as where Coloradans come when Colorado feels too full. And I agree with that. I mean, it's got this incredible, natural resources that really few people know about. I mean, very few people know about kayaking the Box and Taos. Very few people know about, summoning Wheeler and or the yurts that you can stay in overnight. There's just so much out there. Fly fishing in Pecos is world class. So I think there's an incredible, I haven't even been to the Gila yet, but I can't wait to go because I just keep reading about how amazing it is. So I know that I'm personally really excited to explore more of the state, and it's something that drives my passion. I know that there's a ton of folks on our staff who are hunters, conservationists, and so we've asked all of our folks to essentially every time they go out and go camping or go for a great hike, contribute an article, right? And that's really being crowdsourced by most of the of the Albuquerque Journal staff. We have 45 edit staff, and they all hike and bike and do all these things, and so it's great to have them all contributing from their hobbies, essentially. I think that there's so much more we could do, and I would love to. I didn't actually realize it's been on my list to get in touch with Outside Magazine, so I would love to get in touch with more of those narrative nonfiction writers and have them contribute to us. We ran a long form story last week, which was from essentially down south around the Gila, which was, I thought, really beautiful. I think it was 2,500 words. We're about to run a series of our managing editor, Don Friedman, road trip to Alaska, and we're going to run a series of his stories about his time, driving over to Alaska and living in a Sprinter van and all that sort of stuff, and camping in the national parks along the way. But, if we serialize it and run it, that's great. We'd love to be a repository of a lot of the great writing in New Mexico around the outdoors because it is such a mecca. And for me, I think it's such an opportunity. I wish that more people would write about it. When I came here and I was starting to explore the state, I was hungry for that, and I couldn't find much writing about it. And so part of the reason why we're expanding that section is because I felt like there'd be a big audience for it. And I know Pepper Lang, who is the owner's son, and he's going to be moving back here in this summer. He's becoming more and more involved with the paper. He's also a huge outdoorsman and really wants to write a ton about this stuff, or see us write a ton about this stuff. So it's a big investment for the paper moving forward.
Here's a question. I have a couple in the background in my head, but I'll start with you all.
As a follow-up to the popularity of outside activities in New Mexico, there's a huge number of writers, creative writers in the state of New Mexico. You've got the New Mexico Writers that sponsors grants for writers, which I was a recipient once. You've got the New Mexico Book Association. I would be interested in learning how we could publicize our events, our organization, the benefits of our organizations with the journal, maybe in an op-ed. I don't even know if that's a possibility, but how would we go about doing that to make sure we're getting a lot of coverage statewide, not just in Santa Fe?
So yeah, obviously we welcome op-eds. There's a submission form on the website. 600 words is the max, but we look at op-eds from everybody that submits, and we read them all, and we're very, we really do prioritize local op-eds. I think it would be great to get those voices in there. In terms of calendars of events, this is another sort of longer term project I'm working with a group of stakeholders in the state to kind of create an app that can host all of these events, both you should be able to toggle it city by city, and then topic by topic within events. So for example, it drives me nuts that when I'm trying to find my kids sports schedules, I have to go to Instagram on El Dorado, and then I have to like screenshot that page of like their like schedule, and then I have to like write it down, and then I have to physically put it in my calendar, which is like such a pain in the butt. And I was like, I know that there's tons of parents who feel equally frustrated, and so being able to just put sports calendars all in one place, and events calendars, like conference calendars, outside stuff, and then city by city have each of the cities contribute. It's a bigger project that we're working on. We're getting funding from a variety of stakeholders to do it, but it's something that I think would really help with tourism in New Mexico, because being able to go, for example, you know, I volunteer at the horse shelter in Cerrillos with my daughter on Saturdays. So usually I'm up in Cerrillos on Saturday morning, mucking out stalls for horses that have been abandoned on BLM lands. And we go through Madrid, and like every week we're like, and one week we were there and it was like, there was a studio tour, and I was like, oh, I wish we'd known that this existed, because we might have stopped, but we no longer have time. We had a schedule that we were working on. So just being able to like toggle and see city by city what's going on, like, because you can drive through places and not even know that these festivals and fairs and tours are happening, and I think would be a real boon for New Mexico. So that's something that we are working on. It's a longer term project, which we hope to start, like finish the app by the end of this year. But we certainly, I think we've already got the funding secured. It's just a matter of time of getting it done. So, but yeah.
That sounds awesome. Oh, who was here?
So I would like to know what kind of conversations you had between the Langs and yourself before they hired you. About 20 years ago, there were two papers here in Albuquerque, the Tribune and
Excuse me,
the
can
Journal.
you stand up, Kathy, so we can hear you?
There were two papers here, the Tribune and the Journal. The Tribune won a Pulitzer Prize, maybe two. So that was more liberal. The Journal was more conservative, actually very conservative. So what kind of conversation did you have with, and the Tribune went out of business, what kind of conversation did you have with the Langs? I would think you are more liberal, and they're definitely conservative about, okay, how are we going to approach news now, the only newspaper in Albuquerque, their point of view, or have they changed how they're going to, their political persuasion to be more centrist, as opposed to historically what they have been is more very conservative. And I would presume you're more liberal. So what kind of dialogue did you have between them and yourself about how you were going to run the Journal?
So I would correct you in that I'm not actually very liberal. I'm not liberal or conservative or either. I'm very much a journalist on the outside. I don't vote because I believe that the people I cover I should be set apart from. I look at politics very much in the realm of like what's working and what's not working, who's winning, who's losing, and it's much more of like an old school, I would say, approach to journalism rather than anything else. If I were to say I'm anything, I would say I'm incredibly centrist, and that the system that I saw growing up in as a 23-year-old White House correspondent for Bloomberg News, covering Congress, I used to marvel at the four-dimensional chess that you would see in Congress, where they would use all these tricks and all these sort of maneuvers and levers of power to come to a consensus on a big bill. All of those maneuvers and tricks and levers are now being used to just break government more. So I think, if I am anything, I'm somebody who firmly believes that consensus is important on both sides, that everybody should read all sides of an issue, and that all sides of an issue should be presented to everybody so they can understand it. I'm a passionate believer that the middle works, and that you can't, and I hate it when both sides refuse to talk to each other. It's one of my pet peeves. It's like, and I know tons of people in Washington who are like that, but they're like, how can you ever talk to that, and I went to Sarah Sanders' wedding, right? Like, I know her really well. Like, I knew her from Iowa when I covered the her dad, Michael Huckabee's campaign in 2004 and 2008. Conversely, I'm like great friends with like Hillary Clinton's staff, and so I have friends on both sides of the aisle. And one of the things that drives me nuts is when they say to me, how could you ever talk to that person? Like, how could you ever just stomach them? Doesn't they want to make you throw up? And my response to that is, if you are outraged, then I know somebody in Washington or someone in New York who's making a ton of money out of you. Because that is what news is selling these days. It is selling outrage and spin, and they're trying to get you pretty pissed off. And it undermines the ability of anybody to come to a table and talk to one another as rational humans and find middle ground and work out a compromise. Compromise is a dirty word in Washington. And to me, one of the things that I hate the most is that Washington is being played as a zero-sum game. And it used to be a win-win, lose-lose game, where in order to come to any kind of legislation, everybody would win some and everybody would lose some. If you actually play this as a zero-sum game, and somebody actually wins this, then we all lose. Like, there's no question about that. And so I think it's important to tell both sides, and that is very much the conversation I had with the Langs. Now, I will say the Langs actually owned both the Tribune and the Albuquerque Journal. They were told by the FCC that they could not own both in a single media market, and so they had to fold them in together into one paper. It was considered a monopoly, essentially. So, you know, they're very centrist as well. Like, I know their reputation is being very conservative. They are very much of a mind that split government is better, that when you have Republicans having to work with Democrats, and when you have people forced to come to consensus with one another, that government works the best. And that's really the conversations that we had, was like the idea that, you know, I don't believe that any one publication should be, especially a local publication when you're trying to engage in the community, should be one-sided. I don't think we should just portray a liberal side or a conservative side. I think we need to speak to everybody in this community on the whole and portray both sides, which is why I've reformed the opinion page as I did. It was too skewed towards one side. Now I believe it's very in the middle. And that.
So I want to follow on. I know there's a couple of people waiting to ask questions, but one of the questions I had was, are you sensing tension within your staff?
Yeah.
Or as you broker around the state with other newspapers and other journalists, you know that our southern part of the state is very red, and I agree with you, you know, a lot of the news today is to get the magazines or the newspapers sold, which is not a service in my mind, but tell me about the tensions or the kind of brokering you're having to do either within your staff or as you go around to other news sources.
So certainly when I joined the Journal, there was a lot of tension between the opinion staff and the newsroom staff. I think that has mostly gone away. Jeff Tucker, who was our opinion editor, actually retired a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago. To be fair, I will say, in Jeff Tucker's defense, that you know, there used to be 7 members of an editorial board for the Albuquerque Journal, and one by one, over the last year or 2 years, they all left, and he was the only guy left, right? And so he was running the entire editorial section by himself, which is a job that no one should do, right? Like, no one should run an entire editorial board by themselves. And so I think, you know, in expanding back out, we now have 6 members of the editorial board. We're looking for a 7th. We're moving, you know, we're trying to expand the staff, so we have a deputy editorial editor. We have our new editorial editors, our former business editor, Ryan Patel. Algernon Damasa is our deputy opinion editor from Las Cruces, who's down at the scene of the shooting all day today. So we're trying to get many more voices and opinions into the editorial board so that it's much more balanced. And I'm also folding it much more into the newsroom. It used to be really adversarial with the newsroom. Like they would, you know, look at the things that the journalists had written and then they would undermine them or criticize them in oblique ways. And you know, I've now invited Ryan to all of our editorial meetings. He knows exactly what's in the paper. He tries to actually curate an opinion page that speaks to what's in the paper. So if we have an article on juvenile crime, we might then invite a couple of folks to do a point counterpoint on the juvenile crime reforms that are up before the legislature right now. Things like that, where we're trying to sort of match what's on the front page with what's leading the opinion page as well. I don't think the opinion page should be at odds with the newsroom. I think it should be a complement to the newsroom that can allow more expert, in-depth looks that are more opinionated, but also from experts, hopefully, on the issues that are in the rest of the newspaper.
How are you being received by other news sources in New Mexico?
That's a good question. No one's actually reached out to me, so I have no idea.
No, that's okay. Okay, let me go back here.
Well, just jumping off of your last comment, how is it, because I guess we're a part of the New Mexico Press Women. My grandfather worked at Washington Post and my dad at Chicago Tribune from LA Times, and I know that newspapers are definitely a boys' club. How is it navigating, especially in New Mexico, being a female executive editor?
Wow.
Well, I am the first minority female executive editor, I believe, of the Albuquerque Journal, but I'm not the first female editor. So that distinction went to Karen Moses, who led the journal for a very long time. She's great. She did a great job. So I will say, I wrote a book called Broad Influence: How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. It grew out of a story that I wrote for the Senate, about the Senate, in 2013, during the government shutdown, about the women coming together to broker a reopening of the government when none of the men would talk to each other. A little side fact about that, inside Time magazine, we always used to write really snarky headlines as the writers because our headlines never made it through, and they always got changed in New York. And so it's kind of a competition to write the snarkiest headline. And I was actually pretty floored when I wrote this really snarky headline thinking no way it would make it through. And I actually let it through. And the headline was, "Women are the only adults left in Washington." The book looks at critical mass, and so what happens when women reach somewhere between 20 and 30% in any institution, whether it's a legislative body like the Senate or a corporate board, a Navy ship, or an appellate court. There's a huge body of research out there that shows that that's a tipping point, and women's voices are heard differently. They really begin to have a bigger impact when they reach this critical mass, this tipping point. So the book looks at all the places where we've gotten there, and the differences they've made, and then it looks at all the places where we're really far away, like policing, for example, is dismal, and why it's really important to get there. And I would say, so one of the chapters I wrote was about Hollywood, and at that point in 2016, women were 26% producers and executive producers of most content being produced in Hollywood. And folks like Gina Davis, she has this incredible foundation. I forget what it's called, but I would just, if you Google Gina Davis, you'll find it. And they advocate for more women's voices in Hollywood. And it's amazing that they've done incredible work. So it's things even like, if you're gonna have like a sponge at the bottom of the ocean, why does it have to be a dude, SpongeBob, right? Like, why can't it be like Sponge Jane, Like if it's gonna be, extras on a set, why are 70% of extras men? Like, why can't you have equal men and women, things like that. And they were saying to me, Gina Davis told me that, once they reached this tipping point in Hollywood, that the culture of the casting couch would end, right? And so literally the next year, Harvey Weinstein happened and Me Too happened and everything changed. And so I've written since then a bunch of follow-up articles for Time and other places where you've seen that happen with the White House Press Corps, right? Like, so when I first joined the White House Press Corps, it was like Helen Thomas, me, and like maybe like 5 other women. There were not a lot of women in the White House Press Corps. Now they're well over 50%. I think they're actually 55% women in the White House Press Corps. So you've seen this proliferation of women in news and in Hollywood. Now it's not perfect, and Me Too still has a lot of progress to make in other professions, but I think there's definitely, you've seen an impact in the sort of the rings of the stone being thrown in the pond are still going. I think I wrote about this. It was one of the very few columns I don't have time to write very much, but that I wrote was about the female majority in the state legislature here in New Mexico. It's the second largest majority in the country after Nevada, but it's the only state where you have both a female executive, the governor, as well as a majority in the state legislature. So I think New Mexico is a really interesting case study to me, where I feel like women actually have made great strides in representation, or at least are in the process of making great strides in representation. I'm not going to say that sexism doesn't exist here and that there aren't a lot of issues, but it's certainly interesting to watch and write about from that perspective.
Hi, I'm Marilee Danneman. It's great to meet you. I have two questions. One is a very short, kind of short, I think we'll have a relatively simple answer, and the other may be a little more complicated. The relatively simple one has to do with your editorial page and your op-ed page. And I'm just wondering who gets paid. Because it looks to me like I'm seeing a lot of people who are stepping up and volunteering, like a legislator wanting to promote his or her thing that they're advocating. And of course, that's understandable, and I would think they wouldn't get paid. But you've got this thing called inside sources, and I don't know who you identify as a local columnist, so I appreciate knowing a little bit about that. The other question, which is a much more complex issue, I think, is the whole notion of both sides of the story. Because sometimes both sides are not equivalent. And there are so many instances where, first of all, there may be more than two sides. Second of all, it may be that one side is the objective, actual truth, which a journalist should be able to identify, and the other side may be either misunderstandings or lies or something. And the question of, if you're trying to be this fair journalistic newspaper, how you're going to handle that. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Sure. So on the opinion page, we do have a bunch of different tiers. We have op-eds that are submitted to us that we don't pay people to submit to us, and they're just usually state leaders or experts in areas, environmental groups, like people wanting to get a voice out on a specific issue and wanting to be heard. We have a local columnist section where, and that's writers that we are aware of, that we know will pay for their writing. We want to solicit their voices. There aren't that many of them. I'm trying to actually grow that group of people because I'm finding it hard to there just aren't that many. So if you know some folks, I'm happy to take the reference. We do pay for those contributions. On both of those sides, we try not to print more than once every 90 days, so that we don't have people who are constantly in the paper all the time, that we have a diversity of opinions. But that's negotiable, right? So sometimes, especially for a columnist, if they're a great columnist and they're doing something really interesting, we might have a few of their columns on in a particularly timely issue or things like that in a row. It's sort of, we bend our rules as we see fit, but those are generally the guidelines by which we abide. In terms of, it is a trope, right? The idea of fairness and balance in news, and I agree that it doesn't fully exist. It is somewhat of a mirage. I went to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. I was in the class where Al Gore, after he lost the 2000 campaign, came and taught a class at Columbia, and the entire class was about literally fairness in news. He felt so screwed over by that election, and he really felt that he was a huge part of the problem was that the ideals of news were broken. The idea of balance, the idea of quoting one side versus the other. And we had two whole classes. One was on HIV and AIDS, right? So is HIV related to AIDS? In South Africa, they will tell you there is no relationship between HIV and AIDS, but the preponderance of most scientists will tell you, yes, there's absolutely a direct correlation between HIV and AIDS that leads directly to AIDS. Now, similarly, we had a class on climate change. 99% of most scientists believe that climate change exists and it is a human-caused phenomenon. The 1% of people say it doesn't exist, and the current administration will say it doesn't exist in that 1%. It is, how do you follow that balance? How do you sort of say who's right, who's wrong? We are humans, and we are imperfect, and we're going to screw this up, and I expect to hear from people when we do, and we constantly do, right? We have to make the best judgment that we can that represents what we believe is the preponderance of evidence and truth in that, and then try to sort of share that with the public. And in doing so, it is a judgment call. And so sometimes we get people saying to us, this is total BS, and you guys have screwed it up. And we will print those responses when we do. And I think it's important to sort of show those sides. But I think there's also times where you kind of have to say, the preponderance of evidence shows that this is the case, so you got to go with what science says, right? So, yeah.
So that brings me to the second question that I've been harboring in the back, and that is the whole notion of paywall and what becomes truth because it's more available And that's true with AI too, because PrAP or non-paywall material is more available, then it builds on itself, and the society goes with it to some degree. And as you were talking about technology, a lot of times we're just looking at headlines or whatever like that, but the paywall is a big thing. I want to understand your opinion. I know you guys need to get paid, but is there a model that we can get some of that stuff out without, so that the truth actually pervades when you do a search on Google or whatever?
Yeah, we have to get paid, and this is important, right? So, there's this somehow expectation since the beginning of the internet that, writing should be free. And writing is not free. We have a skill set, all of us in this room, we should be paid for our skill set. It is important that people pay for our skill set, otherwise nobody will ever do it. And so I think it's super important to find ways in which we can do that. That said, if it's something really important, like today, if you go to our website, we have put the story about Las Cruces ahead of the paywall. Whenever there's a really important story that is a public service, that is breaking news, that we feel people should be informed about, we will always put it ahead of the paywall. And that is our way of saying, hey, we know we need to get paid for the service, but there are some things that are more important than us getting paid, and you really need to know about this. This is, a huge breaking news story for our state, and so we're going to give it to you for free.
See, two things. I guess I should stand up. Back in the dark days of the really screwed up editorial page.
Lean it towards your mouth.
Oh,
There.
like that?
Yeah.
Okay, back in the really dark days of the really screwed up editorial page, and not the sanitized one we have now. My big objection, I don't mind reading a good editorial or a good column written by a conservative, if it's accurate, if it's verifiable, and if they're not lying. But Tucker never ever edited any of this stuff. He ran it as it came in, and that was my big objection. He also chose the most offensive possible cartoons. And mind you, I speak as a former Journal employee. I worked for the Journal and the Tribune. And so I know what a good editorial page looks like. And so that's my 2 cents worth on that. I also wanted to say something about the search for the middle. I'm a columnist. I've run a syndicate in New Mexico for 20 years. And before that, I wrote editorials and columns for all of the newspapers I worked for. And I have always been in the middle, mostly because I was a business writer. Business gives you a whole different view of the world. And New Mexico's forever need for jobs. And what I'm finding, my syndicate, I didn't set it up. I inherited it from another guy who gave it to me. And our model is we serve rural newspapers. We serve small rural newspapers. And their reality in the rural areas is much different than our reality in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, or Santa Fe, or Las Cruces. And so I write from the middle because I have to write from the middle. I don't have the luxury of dipping towards my possibly liberal tendencies, because I have to reflect their reality back at them, or they will stop reading. And over the years of running this column service, my subscribers have gone from running everything. They would run everything I would send them, and now they pick and choose. They don't agree with it, they won't run it. And so what I'm doing now is I write, most of the time there is no such thing as the middle. So sometimes I write a little on this side, sometimes I write a little on that side, and I keep them reading. And everything in my column can be checked. It can be fact-checked, because I'm very careful. I'm very careful to be accurate and factual. And I start from accurate and factual. And what I'm noticing is that the alternative news sources that are going to save us, I love them dearly. I love Source New Mexico. I rely on them heavily. And also Pat Davis's publications here, Searchlight, but they're lefties. They're lefties. And once again, in rural New Mexico, they're not reflecting the reality of those people out there in Hobbs and Artesia and Farmington and Gallup. And so I think the search for the middle is an ongoing process. And sometimes I hit it and sometimes I don't. I'm always trying.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's truth is super important, and I don't know about the time before me, but I certainly can say for the opinion page now that we fact check everything that comes in. We have a team of folks who do that that are from the newsroom, so we've kind of dispersed that chore to a bunch of different hub reporters. I think fact checking is a good exercise for them to learn and understand how to do. But yeah, it's an ongoing struggle to make sure that we do hit the middle, and like you, we aim for it, we strive for it. We sometimes hit it, sometimes we don't, and it is an ongoing process. I think it is much like legislating. If done right, it is one in which it's very fungible. It's something that moves and adheres and I think reflects the community at large, and something that hopefully we can do better. And there's always the possibility of doing it better, but it is. But hopefully, your salvation doesn't just come from the alternative weeklies and the alternative press. We might play a role in that too.
Oh, I lean on the journal also.
Okay.
Do you think that focusing on the local level plays into the current administration's push to give the responsibility of issues back to the states?
Yeah, I think it does. So certainly it's been really interesting, and one of the things I've tried to do very much is cover national news, but from a local perspective, and it's been a big emphasis. I brought Kathy Cook, who's our federal writer, with me to Washington for a week, introduced her to leadership in the House and Senate, introduced her to some folks in the administration, tried to get her really sourced there so she can, from here, report on a lot of those issues. But I think certainly that's been the focus of what Donald Trump says he wants to do, is give back the power to the states in a lot of ways. So, for example, disbanding the Department of Education is meant to sort of take all of those resources and give them back to the states, right? And so, and what would that look like? I have no idea. It'll be very interesting to see what that comes back to us. But trying to understand it from a local perspective, I think, is, for me, a much easier way of getting my arms around the enormous amount of news that's coming out of Washington that is really oftentimes overwhelming. But just trying to take really specific perspectives locally, I think, is the way that we'd like to approach it. And I think for us has been a really gratifying way of approaching it, because it enables us to go out into the community and say, hey, how is this affecting you? Are these layoffs affecting you? How do you need help with this stuff? Like, is this reorganization going to affect, not just federal workers, but state workers? Like, how is all of this going to happen? Is this going to grow the size of state government? These are big questions that are kind of our time, and I don't think we know the answers to them.
Okay, our last question, and then I will say goodbye to our illustrious guest.
Hi, it's not really a question, but I'm Katie Hamill. I'm a public elementary school teacher in Albuquerque. I just find what you're saying just a breath of fresh air, and I want to say thank you and welcome. I would love to use the paper in my classroom. I gave up on the Journal a long time ago. I'm probably one of 100,000 former readers who couldn't abide it. And despite its benefits and despite our idea to be involved and have kids read the paper, I just so disappointed in the paper. And so I'm really feeling hope, which is so weird. But I think, and you know, I'm cranky about the New York Times too, and I'm super cranky about the Washington Post. So if this is a movement of people who can no longer work in Washington, spreading themselves out and elevating local papers, I don't know if you're singular or if this is a very interesting phenomenon, but I'm glad you're here, and I think I'll subscribe.
Thank you. That's great news.
So that was a nice closing